Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other kids growing up in the small Texas town of Cedar Ridge. While her classmates played with dolls or video games, she spent her afternoons reading medical journals her father brought home from the hospital, where he worked as a janitor. Her mother, Maria, would find her daughter practicing bandaging techniques on her stuffed animals, creating elaborate scenarios where she had to save their lives. The Martinez family didn't have much money, but they had dreams. Sarah's parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was just 2 years old, working multiple jobs to give their daughter opportunities they never had. When Sarah announced at age 16 that she wanted to become a military medic, her parents supported her decision, even though they worried about the dangers she would face. After graduating high school, Sarah enlisted in the Army and was sent to Fort Sam Houston for medical training. The program was intense, covering everything from basic first aid to advanced trauma surgery. Sarah excelled in her studies, but she quickly discovered that academic success didn't translate to acceptance among her peers. Most of the other trainees were men, many coming from military families with generations of service. They looked at Sarah's small frame and quiet demeanor and assumed she wouldn't make it through the rigorous training. At 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, Sarah certainly didn't fit the typical image of a soldier. Her instructors often paired her with larger, more experienced trainees during exercises, assuming she would need the extra help. The doubts became more apparent during combat simulation exercises. While other trainees carried heavy equipment with apparent ease, Sarah struggled with the weight of the standard medical kit, which included everything from bandages and medications to portable defibrillators and emergency surgery tools. The kit weighed nearly 40 pounds, almost a third of Sarah's body weight. During one particularly challenging exercise, the trainees were required to navigate a mock battlefield while carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Sarah was paired with Jake Morrison, a 6-foot-tall former football player from Alabama who made no effort to hide his skepticism about her abilities. "Look, Martinez," Jake said as they prepared for the exercise, "I'm not trying to be mean, but maybe you should consider a different career path. This job requires real strength, and I don't think you have what it takes." Other trainees overheard the comment and began to murmur their agreement. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that words were cheap, and action spoke louder than any argument she could make. The exercise began with simulated explosions and smoke filling the training area. Sarah and Jake were assigned to rescue a wounded soldier played by another trainee who was positioned behind enemy lines. They had to navigate through obstacles, avoid simulated sniper fire, and reach their target within a specific time limit. As they moved through the course, Jake took the lead, assuming Sarah would follow behind him. But when they reached a narrow passage between two concrete barriers, Sarah noticed something Jake had missed. The route he was taking would expose them to the sniper positions for nearly 30 seconds, plenty of time for them to be killed in the simulation. "Wait," Sarah whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. "There's another way." Jake looked annoyed. "Martinez, I've been doing this longer than you. Trust me, this is the fastest route." But Sarah had studied the course layout carefully during their briefing. She had noticed a drainage tunnel that ran underneath the main pathway, providing cover from the sniper positions. It would require crawling through tight spaces, but it would keep them alive. "The tunnel," she said, pointing to a small opening near the base of the concrete barrier. "We can go under." Jake looked at the opening skeptically. "That's going to slow us down, and I'm not sure I can fit through there." Sarah was already moving toward the tunnel entrance. "You go over, I'll go under. We'll meet at the target." Before Jake could protest, Sarah had disappeared into the tunnel, dragging the medical kit behind her. The space was barely large enough for her small frame, and the weight of her equipment made progress difficult. But she pressed forward, using her elbows and knees to propel herself through the darkness. She emerged from the tunnel just as Jake reached the same position, having successfully avoided the sniper fire by taking her suggested alternate route. They worked together to reach their target, a trainee who was simulating a severe abdominal wound. As Sarah began her assessment of the patient, she noticed that Jake was standing back, apparently expecting her to handle the medical portion while he provided security. But the scenario called for both medics to work together to stabilize the patient before evacuation. "Jake, I need you to hold pressure on this wound while I establish in 4-line," Sarah instructed, her voice calm and professional despite the simulated chaos around them. Jake hesitated. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Sarah looked up at him with steady eyes. "Do you want this soldier to live or not?" Something in her tone made Jake respond immediately. He knelt beside the patient and applied pressure to the simulated wound, while Sarah quickly inserted an 4 catheter and began administering fluids. Her movements were precise and confident, each action performed exactly as they had been taught in their medical training. Within minutes, they had stabilized the patient and called for evacuation. The exercise ended with their successful completion of the mission, but Sarah could tell that Jake was still skeptical of her abilities. Over the following weeks, similar scenarios played out repeatedly. Sarah would excel in the medical aspects of their training, but struggle with the physical demands of carrying heavy equipment over long distances. Her fellow trainees began to see her as a liability, someone who might slow them down in a real combat situation. The situation came to a head during their final training exercise before graduation. The scenario involved a mass casualty event with multiple wounded soldiers scattered across a large training area. The trainees were divided into teams, with each team responsible for triaging and treating their assigned casualties. Sarah was assigned to Team 3, led by Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran medic with 15 years of combat experience. The team also included Jake Morrison and 2 other trainees, Marcus Chun and David Lopez. As they prepared for the exercise, Staff Sergeant Williams pulled Sarah aside. "Martinez, I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "Some of the other instructors have concerns about your physical capabilities. This exercise is designed to simulate the worst-case scenario you might face in combat. If you can't keep up, people die. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm ready, Sergeant." Staff Sergeant Williams nodded, but his expression remained doubtful. "All right, but if you fall behind, I'm pulling you from the exercise." "Understood." The exercise began at dawn with the sound of simulated artillery fire. Team 3 was assigned to respond to a convoy attack with an estimated 8 casualties. They had to reach the site, assess the wounded, and establish a field medical station while under simulated enemy fire. As the team moved toward their objective, Sarah noticed that she was indeed falling behind. The combination of her heavy medical kit and the rapid pace set by her teammates was taking its toll. Her breathing became labored, and sweat poured down her face despite the cool morning air. Jake looked back at her and shook his head. "I told you this would happen," he muttered to Marcus, loud enough for Sarah to hear. But Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed forward. She had come too far to give up now. Her parents had sacrificed everything to give her this opportunity, and she wasn't about to let their faith in her be wasted. When they reached the convoy site, the scene was chaotic. Smoke machines created a realistic fog of war, and speakers blared the sounds of gunfire and explosions. 8 actors lay scattered around disabled vehicles, each displaying different types of wounds ranging from minor cuts to severe trauma. Staff Sergeant Williams immediately began barking orders. "Chun, Lopez, secure the perimeter. Morrison, start triage. Martinez, you're with me on the most critical casualties." Sarah dropped her kit and began moving toward a patient who was simulating a severe head injury. As she knelt beside the actor, she began her assessment using the systematic approach she had learned in training. Airway, breathing, circulation. Her hands moved quickly, but carefully, checking for signs of life-threatening injuries. "Sergeant, this one needs immediate evacuation," she called out. "Possible traumatic brain injury with signs of increased intracranial pressure." Staff Sergeant Williams glanced over at her work and nodded approvingly. Sarah had correctly identified the most critical aspects of the patient's condition and was already preparing to stabilize him for transport. As the exercise continued, Sarah moved from patient to patient with increasing confidence. Her small size, which had seemed like such a disadvantage during physical training, actually proved to be an asset in the cramped spaces around the damaged vehicles. She could squeeze into areas where larger medics couldn't reach, allowing her to treat casualties that might otherwise have been inaccessible. During one particularly challenging scenario, a patient was trapped underneath an overturned vehicle with severe bleeding from a leg wound. The space was too narrow for Jake or the other male trainees to reach the victim, but Sarah was able to crawl underneath and apply a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. "Nice work, Martinez," Staff Sergeant Williams said as she emerged from under the vehicle. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that saves lives in combat." For the first time since beginning her training, Sarah felt like she was truly making a difference. The physical challenges were still there, but she was learning to work around them and focus on her strengths. As the exercise neared its conclusion, the trainers introduced an unexpected complication. A new wave of casualties arrived, simulating a second attack on the medical station. Team 3 now had to defend their position while continuing to treat the wounded. Morrison Chun set up a defensive perimeter, Staff Sergeant Williams ordered. "Lopez, help me move these critical patients to cover. Martinez, keep working on that chest wound." Sarah was in the middle of treating a patient with a simulated pneumothorax when she heard Jay call out, "Contact front. Enemy approaching from the tree line." The exercise was designed to test their ability to provide medical care under fire, one of the most challenging aspects of combat medicine. Sarah had to continue her life-saving procedures while simulated bullets flew overhead. Her patient needed immediate decompression of his chest cavity to prevent the collapsed lung from becoming fatal. Sarah had practiced this procedure dozens of times in the classroom, but never under such realistic combat conditions. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared the needle for insertion between the patient's ribs. One wrong move could cause serious injury, even in a training scenario. But as she looked down at the actor portraying the wounded soldier, all of her doubts and fears seemed to disappear. This was what she had trained for. This was why she had endured months of physical and emotional challenges. In this moment, all that mattered was saving a life. Sarah inserted the needle with steady hands and was rewarded with the sound of escaping air, indicating successful decompression of the chest cavity. The patient's simulated breathing immediately improved, and his vital signs stabilized. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Staff Sergeant Williams called out over the sound of simulated gunfire. "That's a life saved right there." As the exercise concluded and the simulation ended, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had proven to herself and others that she could perform under pressure, but she knew that the real test would come when she faced actual combat situations. During the debrief session, Staff Sergeant Williams addressed the entire team. "Today's exercise showed me something important about each of you," he said. "Morrison, your leadership skills are solid, but you need to learn to trust your teammates. Chun and Lopez, excellent work on perimeter security. And Martinez," he paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Martinez, you showed me that heart and determination can overcome physical limitations. Your medical skills are exceptional, and your ability to think clearly under pressure is exactly what we need in combat medics." Jake Morrison looked surprised by the praise Sarah received, but he nodded respectfully. "I guess I was wrong about you," he admitted. "You've got skills I didn't expect." Sarah graduated from medical training with honors and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. She knew that her real challenges were just beginning, but she felt confident in her abilities and ready to serve her country as a combat medic. Her first deployment would come sooner than expected, and it would test everything she had learned in ways that no training exercise could replicate. 6 months after graduation, Sarah found herself on a transport plane heading to Afghanistan. The 82nd Airborne was being deployed to provide support for ongoing operations in the volatile Helmand province. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Bagram airfield, Sarah pressed her face against the small window and watched the stark, mountainous landscape unfold below her. The reality of deployment hit her immediately upon landing. The air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel, and the constant sound of helicopters and military vehicles created a backdrop of organized chaos. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. Every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for real soldiers. Sarah was assigned to Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, and quickly discovered that her reputation from training school had preceded her. The other medics in the unit had heard about the small woman who had excelled in medical procedures, but struggled with physical demands. Some were curious to see how she would perform in actual combat, while others remained skeptical. Her first few weeks in Afghanistan were spent at Forward Operating Base Wilson, a relatively secure compound that served as a hub for operations throughout the region. Sarah used this time to acclimate to the environment and build relationships with the soldiers she would be responsible for treating. One of those soldiers was Specialist Tommy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old machine gunner from Los Angeles who reminded Sarah of her younger brother. Tommy was friendly and outgoing, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood during the long hours of patrol preparation and equipment maintenance. Doc Martinez, Tommy said one afternoon as they cleaned weapons together, "The guys have been talking about you. They say you're pretty good with the medical stuff, but they're wondering if you can handle yourself when things get real." Sarah looked up from the rifle she was cleaning. She had been assigned the additional duty of maintaining several M4 carbines in addition to her medical responsibilities. "What do you think, Rodriguez?" Tommy grinned. "I think anybody who made it through training with Williams has got to be tough. That old sergeant doesn't mess around." It was true that Staff Sergeant Williams had pushed all of his trainees to their limits, but Sarah knew that combat would present challenges that no training could fully prepare her for. She would find out just how true that was during her first real mission outside the wire. The operation was designated Harvest Moon, a joint patrol with Afghan National Army forces designed to disrupt insurgent supply lines in a rural area south of the base. Bravo Company would establish a temporary checkpoint and search vehicles traveling along a major road used by both civilian traffic and suspected militants. Sarah was assigned to 2nd Squad, led by Staff Sergeant Mike Patterson, a veteran of 3 previous deployments who had earned the respect of his men through his calm leadership and tactical expertise. The squad included Tommy Rodriguez on the M240 machine gun, along with 6 other soldiers representing a mix of experience levels. As they prepared for the mission, Staff Sergeant Patterson briefed the squad on their objectives and the potential threats they might face. Intelligence reports suggested that improvised explosive devices were commonly used in the area, and there had been recent attacks on coalition forces. "Martinez, you'll be with the command element," Patterson told Sarah. "Stay close to me, and Rodriguez. If we take casualties, you're our primary medical asset out there." Sarah nodded and checked her medical kit one final time. In addition to her standard supplies, she carried extra morphine, blood clotting agents, and emergency surgical tools. Her weapons consisted of an M4 carbine and a sidearm, both of which she hoped she would never have to use. The convoy departed the base before dawn, using the cover of darkness to reach their objective without being observed by potential enemies. Sarah rode in the second vehicle, a heavily armored MRAP designed to withstand roadside bomb attacks. Despite the protection offered by the vehicle's armor, she could feel her heart racing as they traveled through the unfamiliar terrain. As the sun rose over the Afghan countryside, Sarah got her first clear look at the area they would be operating in. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky hills and sparse vegetation providing limited cover. Scattered compounds and small villages dotted the valley floor, their mud brick walls and flat roofs making them nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The squad established their checkpoint at a strategic location where the main road curved around a small hill, providing good visibility in both directions. They set up defensive positions and began the process of stopping and searching vehicles for weapons or contraband. For the first few hours, the operation proceeded smoothly. They stopped several civilian vehicles and conducted searches without incident. Sarah observed the interactions between the soldiers and local civilians, noting the careful balance between maintaining security and respecting the rights of innocent people. The situation changed dramatically around midday when Tommy Rodriguez spotted movement on the ridgeline above their position. "Patterson, we've got activity on the high ground," he reported over the radio. "Looks like 3 or 4 military-age males with what might be weapons." Staff Sergeant Patterson immediately ordered his men to take cover and called for support from the other squads in the area. Sarah found herself crouched behind a concrete barrier, her medical kit beside her and her rifle ready. "Doc, stay low and be ready to move if we take hits," Patterson instructed her. "These guys like to wait until we're exposed before they open up." Sarah's mouth fell dry as she scanned the ridgeline through her rifle scope. She could see the figures Tommy had spotted, but at this distance, it was impossible to determine their intentions. They could be shepherds watching their flocks, or they could be insurgents preparing to attack. The answer came suddenly, in the form of automatic weapons fire erupting from multiple positions on the hill. Bullets snapped through the air around the checkpoint, sending dust and concrete chips flying as they impacted nearby surfaces. "Contact! Contact!" Patterson shouted into his radio. "Taking fire from multiple positions on Hill 234. Request immediate support." Sarah pressed herself against the concrete barrier as bullets continued to fly overhead. This was nothing like the training exercises she had experienced. The sound of real gunfire was louder and more terrifying than any simulation, and the knowledge that people were actually trying to kill her made her hands shake. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah's training kicked in. She automatically began checking her medical supplies and scanning her teammates for signs of injury. So far, everyone appeared to be unhurt, but she knew that could change in an instant. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Tommy Rodriguez returned fire with his machine gun, sending long bursts toward the enemy positions while the other soldiers maneuvered to better defensive positions. Suddenly, Sarah heard a sharp cry of pain from somewhere to her left. She looked around and saw Private First Class Kevin Matthews clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his uniform. "Medic!" Matthews called out, his voice tight with pain and fear. Sarah didn't hesitate. Despite the continuing gunfire, she grabbed her medical kit and low-crawled toward Matthews' position. Bullets continued to snap overhead, but she focused entirely on reaching her patient. When she reached Matthews, she quickly assessed his wound. The bullet had struck his upper arm, creating an entrance wound but no visible exit wound. He was conscious and alert, which was a good sign, but she needed to stop the bleeding and check for damage to major blood vessels. "Matthews, I need you to stay calm," she told him as she opened her medical kit. "The wound doesn't look too bad, but I need to get a pressure dressing on it." As she worked, Sarah was dimly aware that the gunfire around them was intensifying. Staff Sergeant Patterson was coordinating with other units while his men returned fire at the enemy positions. But all of her attention was focused on treating Matthew's wound. She applied a pressure dressing to stop the bleeding and checked his pulse and blood pressure to ensure that no major arteries had been damaged. Matthews was stable, but he would need evacuation to receive proper surgical treatment. "Patterson, I've got one wounded," she called out over the noise. Matthews took one in the shoulder. "He's stable, but needs evacuation." "Roger that. Document medevac is already en route." "Can he move?" Sarah looked at Matthews, who was pale but alert. "Can you move to better cover?" she asked him. Matthews nodded grimly. "Yeah, I can move." With Sarah supporting his uninjured arm, they moved to a more protected position behind a larger concrete barrier. The movement drew renewed fire from the enemy positions, and Sarah felt the wind from a bullet passing close to her head. As they reached cover, Sarah heard another shout from the opposite side of their defensive perimeter. This time it was specialist James Wilson, and his cries sounded much more serious than Matthews had been. "Doc, need you over here now," Tommy Rodriguez called out. Sarah looked at Matthews, who waved her away with his good arm. "Go help Wilson," he said. "I'll be okay." Moving in a low crouch to avoid the continuing gunfire, Sarah made her way across the checkpoint to where Wilson lay motionless on the ground. What she saw when she reached him made her stomach clench with fear. Wilson had been hit in the abdomen by what appeared to be a large-caliber bullet. His uniform was soaked with blood, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. This was exactly the kind of severe trauma that she had trained for, but seeing it in reality was far different from any classroom exercise. "Wilson, can you hear me?" she asked as she began her assessment. Wilson's eyes were open but unfocused. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper. "Can't breathe." Sarah quickly cut away Wilson's uniform to expose the wound. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The bullet had created a large hole in his abdomen, and she could see that he was bleeding internally. Without immediate surgery, he would die within minutes. But they were in the middle of a firefight, pinned down by enemy fire with no immediate way to evacuate casualties. Sarah had to stabilize Wilson using only the supplies in her kit under combat conditions, while people were actively trying to kill her. She worked with steady hands despite the chaos around her. First, she applied pressure to the external wound to slow the bleeding. Then, she established a four-line to replace the fluids Wilson was losing. The whole time, bullets continued to snap overhead and impact the ground nearby. "How's he looking, Doc?" Staff Sergeant Patterson called out from his position. "Critical," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "He needs surgery now, or we're going to lose him." As if in response to her words, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The medevac bird was approaching, but they were still taking fire from the enemy positions. The helicopter wouldn't be able to land until the area was secure. "All units, this is Bravo 6, came the voice of their company commander over the radio. "We have fast movers inbound to suppress the enemy positions. Take cover and mark your positions with smoke." Sarah continued working on Wilson as the sound of jet engines grew louder overhead. Air support was coming to help them, but she didn't know if Wilson would survive long enough to be evacuated. His blood pressure was dropping, and his breathing was becoming more labored. Sarah administered morphine for pain management and continued to monitor his vital signs, but she knew she was fighting a losing battle against time and physiology. Then, she heard the sound she had been hoping for, the roar of jet engines followed by explosions on the hillside above them. The airstrike had found its targets, and the enemy gunfire began to slacken. Within minutes, the area was secure enough for the medevac helicopter to land. Sarah watched as the flight medic jumped out and ran toward their position, carrying additional medical equipment. "What V you got?" the flight medic asked as he knelt beside Wilson. Sarah quickly briefed him on Wilson's condition and the treatment she had provided. The flight medic nodded approvingly as he examined her work. "Good job stabilizing him," he said. "Let's get him loaded." Together, they transferred Wilson to a stretcher and carried him to the waiting helicopter. Matthews followed under his own power, still clutching his wounded shoulder. Sarah watched as the helicopter lifted off and disappeared over the horizon, carrying her patients toward the surgical facilities that could save their lives. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Sarah realized that she was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the firefight was wearing off, leaving her feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. Staff Sergeant Patterson approached her as she was repacking her medical kit. "How you holding up, Doc?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much in too short time. "I'm okay, Sergeant. Just glad we got them out alive." Patterson nodded. "You did good work out there. Both of those soldiers are alive because of what you did under fire." Over the following days, Sarah learned that both Matthews and Wilson had survived their wounds and were recovering at the medical facility in Germany. The news brought her immense relief, but It also made her realize how much responsibility rested on her shoulders as the unit's primary medical asset. Word of her actions during the firefight quickly spread throughout the battalion. The soldiers who had initially doubted her capabilities began to see her in a different light. She had proven that she could perform under fire, saving lives while risking her own. 3 months after the firefight that had proven her medical skills under fire, Sarah found herself facing an entirely different kind of challenge. The 82nd Airborne had been tasked with a special mission that would require skills far beyond her medical training, skills that would finally silence the doubts of those who still questioned whether a small woman belonged in combat. The mission briefing took place in a secure tent at Forward Operating Base Wilson. Sarah sat among 30 other soldiers as Major Thompson, their battalion commander, outlined the situation they were facing. Intelligence has confirmed the location of a high-value target in the village of Kar Sang, Major Thompson began, pointing to a map projected on a large screen. This individual is responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. We have a narrow window of opportunity to capture him before he relocates. Sarah listened intently as the major described the target compound and the surrounding area. The village was located in a remote valley, accessible only by narrow mountain paths that would be heavily defended. The mission would require a combination of stealth, speed, and overwhelming firepower if they encounter resistance. The challenge, Major Thompson continued, is that our target is reportedly being protected by a significant number of fighters, including at least 2 trained snipers positioned in the hills above the village. Intelligence suggests these snipers are equipped with long-range precision rifles and have extensive combat experience. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Snipers were every soldier's worst nightmare. Invisible enemies who could kill from enormous distances without warning. She had trained on various weapons systems during her military service, but her primary focus had always been on medical skills rather than marksmanship. To counter this threat, the major said, "We'll be deploying our own sniper teams to provide overwatch and eliminate the enemy shooters before the main assault begins. However, we have a problem." Major Thompson paused and looked around the room at the assembled soldiers. Staff Sergeant Collins, our primary sniper, was injured during yesterday's patrol and is currently in Germany receiving medical treatment. His spotter, Sergeant Kim, is also unavailable due to family emergency leave. Sarah wondered why this information was being shared with the entire unit. Surely they had other qualified snipers who could take Collins' place on such an important mission. This leaves us with a significant capability gap, the major continued. We have the Barrett M82 50 caliber rifle system, but we need someone qualified to operate it effectively at the ranges we're dealing with. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's company commander, raised his hand. "Sir, what about cross-training some of our best marksmen? Surely we have soldiers who could learn the system quickly enough." Major Thompson shook his head. "The timeline doesn't allow for proper training. We need someone who already has experience with precision shooting and can adapt to the Barrett system within the next 48 hours. That's when Sarah realized why she had been included in this briefing. During her training at Fort Sam Houston, she had scored expert marksman ratings with multiple weapon systems. She had also spent considerable time on the shooting range during her deployment, partly to maintain her skills and partly because she found the precision and focus required for marksmanship to be relaxing after the stress of medical duties. But there was a significant difference between shooting targets at known distances and engaging enemy snipers at extreme ranges in combat conditions. The Barrett M82 was a massive weapon system, weighing nearly 30 pounds and firing ammunition designed to disable vehicles and penetrate concrete walls. It was definitely not designed with someone of Sarah's small stature in mind. Major Thompson's eyes found Sarah in the crowd. "Specialist Martinez, I understand you have excellent marksmanship scores. Have you ever trained on heavy sniper systems?" Sarah stood up, feeling the eyes of every soldier in the room upon her. "No, sir, but I'm willing to learn if the mission requires it." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled soldiers. Many of them were still adjusting to the idea of Sarah as their primary medic, and now she was volunteering to take on the role of sniper as well. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, one of the more experienced soldiers in the unit, spoke up. "Sir, with all due respect, Martinez is barely big enough to carry that rifle, let alone shoot it accurately. Maybe we should consider other options." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with familiar embarrassment, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard similar comments throughout her military career, and she had learned that the best response was always to let her actions speak louder than any words. Major Thompson looked thoughtful. Sergeant Webb raises a valid concern about the physical demands of operating the Barrett system. However, Specialist Martinez has proven herself under fire, and we're running out of time to find alternatives. He turned back to Sarah. "Specialist Martinez, report to the range immediately after this briefing. Master Sergeant Johnson will evaluate your capabilities with the Barrett system. If he determines that you can operate it effectively, you'll be given the mission." The briefing concluded with detailed discussion of timing, logistics, and contingency plans. Sarah barely heard most of it, as her mind was focused on the enormous challenge she had just volunteered for. She would have less than 48 hours to master a weapon system she had never used, then use it in combat against trained enemy snipers. After the briefing ended, several soldiers approached Sarah with expressions ranging from concern to outright disbelief. Tommy Rodriguez, who had become a close friend since their firefight experience, pulled her aside. "Doc, are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "That Barrett rifle is a beast. Even big guys struggle with it." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had already made up her mind. "Tommy, they need someone for this mission, and I'm the best option they have right now. I can't let the team down." Tommy nodded reluctantly. "All right, but be careful. That 50 cal has a kick that'll knock you into next week if you're not ready for it." Sarah made her way to the shooting range, where Master Sergeant Johnson was waiting with the Barrett M82 rifle system. The weapon was even more imposing up close than she had imagined. The barrel alone was nearly 4 feet long, and the entire system looked like it belonged on a vehicle rather than being carried by an individual soldier. "Specialist Martinez," Master Sergeant Johnson said as she approached. "I have to admit, I'm surprised you volunteered for this. Have you ever fired anything larger than an M4? Sarah shook her head. "No, Master Sergeant, but I'm a quick learner, and I understand the fundamentals of precision shooting." Johnson looked skeptical but professional. "All right, let's start with the basics. The Barrett fires a 50 caliber BMG round, which is essentially a small artillery shell. The effective range is over a mile, and the recoil is unlike anything you've experienced with smaller weapons." For the next hour, Master Sergeant Johnson walked Sarah through every aspect of the weapon system. He showed her how to load the massive cartridges, how to adjust the scope for different ranges and wind conditions, and how to properly position her body to absorb the tremendous recoil. When it came time for her first shot, Sarah felt nervous but determined. She positioned herself behind the rifle, adjusted her grip according to Johnson's instructions, and aimed at a target 800 meters downrange. The explosion of sound and force that followed her trigger pull was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Despite Johnson's warnings and her preparation, the recoil knocked her backward and left her ears ringing. The target, however, showed a clean hole just inches from the center. Master Sergeant Johnson looked surprised. "That's actually pretty good for a first shot. How are you feeling?" Sarah's shoulder ached from the impact, and she could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue, but she was encouraged by the accuracy of her shot. "I'm fine, Master Sergeant. Let's keep going." Over the following hours, Sarah fired dozens of rounds at targets ranging from 500 to 1,500 meters. With each shot, she became more comfortable with the weapon's characteristics and more accurate with her placement. Master Sergeant Johnson provided constant feedback, helping her adjust her technique to maximize both accuracy and her ability to handle the massive rifle. By the end of the first day, Sarah was consistently hitting targets at ranges beyond anything she had attempted with smaller weapons. Her shoulder was bruised and sore, but she had proven that she could operate the Barrett system effectively despite her small size. "I'm impressed," Johnson admitted as they secured the weapon for the night. "You've got a natural feel for long-range shooting. But tomorrow we'll test you under more realistic conditions." The next day's training involved shooting from various positions and dealing with simulated stress factors. Sarah practiced engaging targets while lying prone, kneeling, and even standing with a rifle supported on improvised rests. Each position presented its own challenges, particularly for someone of her size trying to control such a large weapon. The most challenging part of the training came when Johnson introduced time pressure and simulated distractions. Sarah had to acquire and engage targets quickly while speakers blared recorded sounds of gunfire and explosions. This was designed to simulate the stress and confusion of actual combat conditions. During one particularly difficult exercise, Sarah was required to engage 3 targets at different ranges within a 60-second time limit while under simulated enemy fire. The targets were positioned at 800, 1200, and 1600 meters, requiring her to make significant adjustments to her scope between shots. As the exercise began, Sarah forced herself to remain calm and follow the methodical approach Johnson had taught her. She acquired the first target, made the necessary scope adjustments for range and wind, and fired. The target showed a clean hit. Without pausing, she shifted to the second target and repeated the process. This shot was more difficult due to the increased range, but her training paid off with another successful hit. The final target was at the extreme edge of her effective range. Sarah knew she would have only one chance to make the shot before time expired. She took a deep breath, made her final adjustments, and squeezed the trigger. Through her scope, she watched the massive bullet trace its arc through the air and strike the distant target dead center. Master Sergeant Johnson was staring at his stopwatch in disbelief. 47 seconds, he announced. "That's faster than most of our experienced snipers could manage that course." Word of Sarah's remarkable performance with the Barrett rifle quickly spread throughout the base. Soldiers who had previously questioned her capabilities were forced to reconsider their assumptions. But Sarah knew that the real test would come during the actual mission. The assault on Karsang village began before dawn on the third day. Sarah was positioned on a ridgeline overlooking the target area, nearly 2 kilometers away from the village. Her mission was to provide overwatch for the approaching ground forces and eliminate any enemy snipers who revealed their positions. As she lay prone behind the Barrett rifle, scanning the terrain through her powerful scope, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. Everything she had worked for, all the training and preparation had led to this moment. The first sign of enemy activity came when she spotted movement on a hillside across the valley. Through her scope, she could see 2 figures in camouflaged clothing setting up what appeared to be a sniper position. They were approximately 1,400 meters away, well within the effective range of her weapon. "Overwatch, this is ground team," came the voice of Captain Rodriguez over her radio. "We're beginning our approach. Any sign of enemy snipers?" Sarah keyed her radio. "Ground team, I have eyes on 2 possible snipers at grid reference 24 SUD 456 789. Permission to engage?" "Permission granted. Take them out." Sarah adjusted her scope for the range and wind conditions, then settled into her firing position. Through the crosshairs, she could see one of the enemy snipers preparing to fire down at the approaching ground forces. She had to act quickly before he could endanger her fellow soldiers. The Barrett rifle thundered, sending its massive projectile across the valley in less than 2 seconds. Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy sniper was thrown backward by the impact, his weapon flying through the air. The second sniper immediately began searching for the source of a shot that had killed his partner. Sarah shifted her aim and fired again, eliminating the second threat before he could locate her position. "Good shooting, Overwatch," Captain Rodriguez reported. 2 targets down. Continue scanning for additional threats." The ground assault proceeded smoothly, with Sarah providing protective overwatch from her distant position. She eliminated several more enemy fighters who attempted to engage the ground forces, each shot demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of the Barrett system in the right hands. When a mission concluded successfully with the capture of their high-value target, Sarah had fired 11 rounds and scored 11 hits, protecting her fellow soldiers and contributing directly to the mission's success. As the ground forces prepared to return to base, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over her radio one final time. "Outstanding work up there, Martinez. Nobody's laughing at the medic anymore." Sarah smiled as she began the process of securing her weapon and preparing to rejoin her unit. She had started her military career being doubted because of her size and gender. She had proven herself as a medic under fire, saving lives while risking her own. And now she had demonstrated that she could master any challenge her service demanded, even lifting the mighty Barrett rifle to protect her fellow soldiers. The soldiers who had once questioned whether she belonged among them now looked at her with respect and admiration. She had shown that courage, determination, and skill were not measured by physical size or gender, but by the willingness to serve others and excel under pressure. As she made her way down from her sniper position, carrying the massive Barrett rifle that had seemed so impossible just days before, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. The little girl who had bandaged stuffed animals in her childhood bedroom had become a warrior capable of saving lives and taking them when necessary to protect her fellow soldiers. The laughter had stopped, replaced by the quiet respect of soldiers who knew they could count on her when everything was on the line.